Evelyn Johnson looked like any other dignified older woman traveling in first class, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, and her neatly pressed light blue blouse a testament to a lifetime of refined taste. She moved with quiet grace down the aisle of the airplane, clutching the thin strap of her brown leather purse as if it contained her history. Yet beneath her gentle exterior lay a story of hidden sorrow and simmering defiance. When Evelyn softly requested a glass of water, the flight attendant, Cassandra, greeted her with an arrogant smirk and a dismissive attitude that hinted at a bias rooted in both age and appearance. Instead of offering a courteous answer, Cassandra deliberately knocked the cup from Evelyn's hand, spilling water across her carefully ironed blouse in a humiliating display that silenced the murmuring first-class passengers. The entire cabin fell into a stunned silence as Cassandra's brazen act unfolded. Nearby passengers, too absorbed in their personal affairs or perhaps paralyzed by the entrenched class prejudices that had seeped into every corner of modern society, looked away instead of intervening. Yet no one noticed the man quietly observing the unfolding drama from the seat behind Evelyn. Brandon Walker, a powerful tech investor whose influence ran deep in every aspect of the airline industry, was not merely a high-flying businessman. He was Evelyn's devoted son. When Brandon finally rose from his seat and, with an icy calm, demanded an explanation in a measured tone, the atmosphere shifted. His measured voice carried the weight of authority and a promise of a reckoning that was to come, one that would not only expose Cassandra's callous behavior, but also deliver a retribution that would echo like a resounding clap of justice. In that charged moment, Brandon's words cut through the stagnant air as he accused Cassandra of more than just a careless mistake. He laid bare how she had not only insulted his gentle mother, but had also dismissed her out of an underlying prejudice that suggested Evelyn did not belong in such an environment. His accusation carried the sting of racism and ageism intermingled, a combination so potent that it resonated with every weary soul who had ever felt marginalized. The humiliation of his mother was seen as an affront to every dignity battered by a society that favored the young, the powerful, and the conventionally attractive. Cassandra's face lost its forced smile, her features contorting under the realization that her actions had crossed an irredeemable line. Brandon remained composed, yet every fiber of his being radiated the promise of a dramatic response. With a swift touch of his smartphone and a series of decisive keystrokes, he set in motion a chain of events that would soon dismantle the very foundation of the airline's operation if Cassandra's transgressions were not remedied immediately. In a matter of moments, what had begun as a small act of disrespect transformed into an uproar of power, injustice, and long-simmering intolerance. The passengers exchanged anxious glances as the first-class cabin became the stage for a breathtaking declaration of retribution. A retribution that would see the forces of corporate might and personal vengeance merge to deliver a message that no one, especially not an elderly, dignified woman like Evelyn, should ever be disrespected or degraded simply because she looked different or was perceived as weak. In that singular moment, as Evelyn's eyes welled with both pain and the hope of impending justice, the true essence of American resolve was laid bare, a promise that even in the midst of discrimination and cruelty, the brave would rise to assert their rights, ensuring that disrespect and malice would never go unchallenged. Evelyn Johnson had always carried herself with dignity, her silver hair immaculate and her light blue blouse pressed to perfection. But nothing could have prepared her for the disgrace she suffered on that flight. Earlier, when she had politely asked for a glass of water, a flight attendant had purposely knocked the cup from her hand. Today, as the plane soared through 35,000 feet and the drama unfolded in slow motion, things took a turn that no one could have predicted. You see, while most of the first-class passengers pretended not to notice, a storm was brewing in the cabin that would shake the very core of the airline. It began when Cassandra, the flight attendant who had already shown her disdain through thoughtless actions, found herself cornered by a series of uneasy whispers from both colleagues and passengers. "You mean the guy in 1B?" someone asked, and Cassandra nodded, her face paling with panic and shame. Brooke, another attendant with a mix of compassion and disbelief in her tone, hesitated as she tried to process what was unfolding. "That's Brandon Walker. His company owns half of the Wi-Fi system we use. He's the reason this airline even got those new planes last year." Cassandra's throat tightened. She admitted in a barely audible voice that she hadn't even recognized him, a fact that only magnified her carelessness. Brooke crossed her arms and said, "You didn't have to know who he was. You just had to treat her like a person." There was no room for indifference here, because Evelyn had been more than just another passenger. Then, the in-flight phone rang again with a shrill urgency that cut through the chatter. Cassandra jumped at the sound, and Brooke, ever the voice of reason, picked up the phone. "It's the captain," she said softly, passing the receiver back to Cassandra. With trembling fingers, Cassandra pressed the receiver to her ear as her face drained of color. A firm, controlled voice announced, "You are to remain in the galley until further notice. When we land, you'll be escorted from the aircraft by security. Do not approach the passenger in 1A again." The line fell silent, leaving Cassandra to grapple with the reality of her actions. As she slowly lowered the phone back onto its hook, her breathing quickened and her hands shook uncontrollably. Brooke's disappointed stare said it all. In seat 2A, Evelyn Johnson, who had endured enough humiliation to last a lifetime, remained unaware of the chaos behind the curtain, yet she could feel the weight of change in the atmosphere, a heaviness that pressed upon every shoulder in that first-class cabin. Beside Evelyn, Brandon Walker, Evelyn's devoted son and one of the most influential tech investors in the country, sat rigidly with his jaw clenched. His earlier calm demeanor had transformed into silent determination as he observed the aftermath of his mother's disgrace. With every passing second, the tension mounted. The passengers, who moments before were engaged in their own digital worlds, now exchanged furtive glances as if collectively holding their breath. Evelyn herself shifted ever so slightly in her seat, attempting to dry her drenched blouse with a napkin. The sensation of the cold water clinging to her skin was a constant reminder of the cruelty she had suffered. Yet her silence only deepened the growing discontent among those who had witnessed the injustice. The disquiet in the cabin was palpable. Around them, murmurs and whispers spread like wildfire. One older man in a business suit leaned over to his wife and whispered that someone had filed a complaint, an official one no less, against Cassandra. Rumors swirled. Some claimed that Brandon Walker, seated in 1B, was not only an influential investor but also had direct ties to the board of the airline. Different versions emerged from every corner, yet one fact remained indisputable. Something truly serious had transpired. In the galley, Cassandra's fingers drummed nervously against the cold metal counter, her mind racing with half-formed excuses. Perhaps she could say that Evelyn had been aggressive, or claim the entire incident was nothing more than an unfortunate accident. But deep down, Cassandra knew that no explanation could wash away the stain on her reputation. The authoritative voice from the captain's call had sealed her fate, stripping her of any semblance of control over the situation. Before long, the curtain of tension lifted slightly as Brooke returned to the galley, a folded sheet of paper clutched in her hand. "They're faxing this to the gate team," she explained quietly. "It's a formal incident report, and you're listed in it." Cassandra did nothing but stare, her eyes avoiding the harsh scrutiny of accountability. Brooke's dismay was clear. "Why didn't you just give her the water?" she pressed, her tone a mix of exasperation and sorrow. Cassandra, voice barely above a whisper, muttered, "I didn't think she belonged up here." The implication hung in the air, a chilling admission that Evelyn was judged solely on her appearance, solely on preconceived notions of who was worthy of respect and dignity. Back in the cabin, a young man seated in 2A leaned over to Brandon. "Excuse me, I saw what happened earlier. That wasn't right. If there's anything I can do," he began. Brandon's eyes, cold and deliberate, met his gaze as he replied, "You saw it, and you did nothing." The young man swallowed hard, retreating into his seat, his heart sinking with the realization that even those who recognized the wrong in the world sometimes chose silence over intervention. Evelyn, meanwhile, reached out with a trembling hand to gently touch her son's wrist. "Let it go," she whispered with quiet reassurance. Brandon's expression softened for a fleeting moment, but the embers of anger still burned behind his eyes. "You shouldn't have to ask me that," he said softly, his voice laced with a mix of sorrow and fury. "After the way she was treated, I've seen enough in my lifetime to know that people's true colors show through when they think nobody's watching." Evelyn replied, her voice heavy with experience. "What matters now is what happens next." The engines hummed steadily as time seemed to slow in that fateful moment, and every heartbeat in the cabin resonated with the collective anticipation of retribution. Passengers tried to resume their magazines or movies, but the quiet devastation of the event held them captive. The spectacle of cruelty and prejudice was still unfolding, a storm that had gathered force beneath the surface of the flight. Every eye in the cabin bore witness to the unspeakable insult delivered to a woman who had spent her life upholding dignity and grace despite countless hardships. At 15:25, the silent agreement was unmistakable. When Brandon went quiet, it meant that plans were being set in motion. Plans that would soon shake the very foundations of the airline. In the cockpit, the captain received another call from ground control. "Be advised," the voice said firmly. "Mr. Walker's office has filed a legal report. Video footage has been retrieved from cabin surveillance. Do not allow the crew member involved to deplane until security arrives." The captain acknowledged with a curt nod, his eyes hidden behind the reflective glass of the cockpit. He turned to the co-pilot and said, "We've got company waiting when we land." The co-pilot responded with a low whistle and a shake of his head, a silent recognition that nothing about this incident was trivial. It was never merely about a spilled drink. It was about the exploitation of power, the cruelty of prejudice, and the stark injustice that often went unchallenged. As Cassandra sank into the fold-down crew seat, her legs weak and hands shaking uncontrollably, a part of her realized that this incident would be remembered far beyond the confines of that fateful flight. She had already cost herself more than just a job. It was as if the entire plane had become an arena of judgment where every passenger played a part, however reluctantly, in calling out the inhumanity of her action. Brooke, standing silently across the aisle with arms crossed, exuded the weary resignation of someone who had seen too much injustice to simply ignore it now. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Cassandra mumbled, her voice trembling as if each word was a confession of her sins. Brooke's response was a loaded pause before she finally said, "You didn't think she belonged. You made that choice before you even knew her name." The silence following that statement was heavy and unyielding, filled with the unspoken indictment of every single person in that cabin. Behind closed eyes and subdued whispers, it was clear that Evelyn Johnson's mistreatment was no isolated occurrence, but part of a larger pattern of discrimination that haunted too many lives. As Cassandra leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes, her resignation was palpable. In seat 2A, Evelyn's tired eyes told the story of a lifetime of silent battles, fought with grace and fortitude. Brandon, ever the silent force, scanned the cabin and saw that no one dared meet his eyes. Those who had witnessed the humiliation now clutched their untouched meals or buried themselves in their devices. One by one, the passengers had borne witness to the truth. A woman of dignity had been publicly shamed, and no one had stepped forward to defend her. With deliberate intent, Brandon picked up his phone once more and typed a short message. "Prepare the legal response. I want full documentation before landing. No press, no soft statements." In that moment, every word he sent was a promise of accountability. a promise that this injustice would be met with retribution so spectacular that it would leave even the most hardened hearts in awe. Evelyn, though lost in her own quiet despair, managed a fleeting glance at her son, a glance that conveyed both gratitude and sorrow. It was the same look she had given him when he was just a boy, and now it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. As the plane continued its smooth journey through the clear skies of America, the interior remained charged with a tension that was as palpable as it was silent. Every footstep, every whisper was a testament to the battle that lay ahead. A battle not just for respect, but for justice in a world too often marred by indifference and cruelty. In that moment, the storm of retribution was gathering force, and it was clear that this was only the beginning of a reckoning that would shake the foundations of an unjust system and restore the dignity that had been so callously stripped away from Evelyn Johnson. Evelyn Johnson had endured more than a lifetime of silent battles, but nothing in her years of graceful perseverance could have prepared her for the humiliating storm that was unfolding on that flight. Even as she sat quietly in seat 1A with her soaked blouse clinging stubbornly to her, the murmurs of the other first-class passengers grew louder. People whispered about the incident as if it were the most scandalous piece of gossip in the world. In hushed tones, a man in a crisp blazer confided to his companion that he had seen the way Evelyn looked, a look mixed with pain and resignation that made even the most hardened souls pause in empathy. "Did you see how she looked at her?" he murmured, and another voice replied, "Yeah, it's messed up." The conversation shifted quickly to the influential man in seat 2B. "That guy's loaded," someone said, referring to Brandon Walker, the man whose wealth and power flowed through the veins of America's tech industry. He owns two of the biggest infrastructure firms in tech, and the airline practically kisses his shoes when he walks into a meeting. Even as these words were exchanged, they carried with them not only awe but also the bitter recognition of how deeply intertwined money and power could be with respect and dignity. The whispers, though soft, spread like wildfire across the cabin. A woman seated across from Brandon leaned forward and said, "Mr. Walker, I just want to say I'm sorry for what happened. It was wrong. I should have said something." Yet Brandon's piercing, cold response cut through the tender attempt at compassion as he quietly remarked, "But you didn't." His tone left no room for debate, and his unwavering gaze indicated that he was determined to hold everyone accountable for their silence and complicity. Meanwhile, behind the curtain separating the crew area from the rest of the cabin, Cassandra was a portrait of despair. Once proud in her role, her lipstick had already faded and the neat bun in her hair had fallen apart. With her elbows resting on her knees and her face buried in her hands, she sat as if the weight of her actions had finally caught up to her. For years, she had managed drunk passengers, navigated turbulence, and even handled a perilous emergency landing without batting an eye. Yet nothing had prepared her for the fallout of treating Evelyn like an inconvenience rather than a human being. Cassandra's internal torment was palpable as she replayed the events over and over again in her mind. She remembered the way she had leaned in and raised her voice, the sneer in her tone when she said that perhaps Evelyn was not accustomed to first class. It was that single rash act of flicking the cup from Evelyn's trembling hand that had ignited the fury of Brandon Walker and exposed the raw prejudice that lay beneath her indifferent facade. As the cabin continued to hum with a tension that was impossible to ignore, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with the latest update from ground control. "Ground team again. Walker's office has confirmed the report. His legal advisor will meet him at the gate and a representative from the airline board will be waiting." The captain's measured sigh offered no consolation, only the stark reminder that the consequences of this incident were about to come crashing down. Up in the cabin, as Evelyn sat motionless, the cold dampness of the spilled water had long since turned to a chill that seeped into her very core. But her silence was not weakness. It was a testament to a lifetime of restraint, honed by years of being talked over, dismissed, and underestimated. With her eyes fixed on the window, Evelyn's reflection showed a woman who, despite the humiliation, radiated a quiet strength and dignity. Across the aisle, Brandon's eyes burned with a calculated anger that was as silent as it was potent. He picked up his phone again and sent a terse message. Prepare the legal response. Full documentation, no press, no soft statements. Every letter he typed was steeped in the resolve to ensure that the airline understood there would be dire consequences for their neglect and outright cruelty. The atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly oppressive as more passengers became unwilling witnesses to the scandal. Some began texting frantically, relaying every detail of the ordeal to friends or family on the ground, while others simply stared at the safety card with vacant expressions. The tension was further amplified by the sharp contrast between the luxurious environment of first class and the rudely unrefined treatment that Evelyn had suffered. One passenger, almost in a conspiratorial whisper, remarked how the airline might never cover for a flight attendant who had dared to treat a woman of Evelyn's stature so callously. It was clear to everyone that this was not an isolated incident, but a manifestation of deep-seated prejudices that had no place in modern America. A country that prided itself on progress, yet still struggled to protect its most vulnerable citizens. Meanwhile, behind the closed curtain of the galley, Cassandra continued to unravel emotionally. Brooke, another crew member who had witnessed the events and now stood silently by a galley cart, finally confronted Cassandra. "So, if she wasn't someone important, it would have been okay?" Brooke's tone was a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. Cassandra's voice trembled as she muttered, "I just didn't know who she was." Brooke's sharp retort followed. "That may be so, but that is exactly what you did. You treated her like a problem, like she didn't matter." Cassandra's internal struggle was laid bare as she wanted to scream and defend herself, to argue that her actions were not born out of malice but from a twisted sense of duty and routine that had long blinded her to the humanity of her passengers. But her words were lost, replaced by the suffocating silence that blanketed the galley. In the midst of this emotional turmoil, the flight continued its descent. The captain's latest announcement over the intercom, reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts and return their tray tables to the upright position, felt increasingly hollow against the backdrop of what had just transpired. The plane tilted gently downward, as if symbolizing the inevitable downfall of those who had perpetrated such injustice. Outside the windows, soft clouds moved by like delicate, indifferent curtains. But inside, every inch of the cabin bore the weight of a collective unspoken vow that no one, not even a dignified woman like Evelyn Johnson, should ever be treated with such disdain. Evelyn, though visibly exhausted and pained by the cold water that continued to dry on her blouse, maintained a serene composure that belied the tumult within. In a rare moment of vulnerability, she turned her head slightly toward her son and whispered, "You always said I needed to speak up more." A faint smile touched her lips, softening the harsh lines etched by years of silent endurance. Brandon's eyes, still burning with a righteous fire, flickered with a momentary softness before hardening once again. "People saw it, Mom. No one said a word until now, and those who do speak up eventually pay a price." His tone was not accusatory, but filled with the heavy weight of responsibility, a burden he was willing to bear to reclaim the dignity stolen from his mother. As the plane began its final approach toward the city below, the murmurs among the passengers turned into a kind of collective anticipation. Their eyes, once busy with trivial distractions, now fixed on the unfolding drama. Every glance, every silent nod was a pledge of solidarity against the quiet but monstrous prejudice that had tainted this flight. For Evelyn, each passing moment was both an ordeal and a vindication. Her lifelong patience was about to be rewarded with the long-awaited justice that came from Brandon's powerful network and the unmistakable message that cruelty would no longer be tolerated. In the final moments before landing, Brandon glanced down at Evelyn and asked softly, "You feeling okay?" Despite the deep sorrow in her eyes, she managed a small nod and replied, "I'm fine, sweetheart. just tired." Yet Brandon's response was resolute as he continued, "After we land, I want you to go straight to the lounge. They're sending a car. This isn't just about a spilled drink, Mom. It's about sending a message. Next time, they will think twice before treating someone like you as if you are invisible." His voice, though calm, was laden with finality. Evelyn's eyes searched his face, questioning whether such drastic measures were necessary, but Brandon did not waver. "You didn't ask for this, Mom, but it happened, and they need to learn," he declared. In that tender yet incendiary moment, a profound shift had occurred, a reckoning that extended far beyond the confines of a single flight, reaching into the very heart of an unjust system that had taken advantage of the vulnerable. As the cabin settled into an eerie silence during the descent, every passenger was forced to confront the truth that an ordinary flight had become the stage for a profound moral drama where every slight, every act of discrimination was etched into memory. The final announcement from the captain, instructing them to prepare for landing, resonated less as a courtesy and more like the prelude to retribution. Behind closed curtains, Cassandra sat frozen, unable to escape the reality that her actions had irrevocably altered her life, while Brandon's legal team was mobilizing to ensure that no one would ever again be allowed to treat a woman like Evelyn Johnson with such callous indifference. In that charged atmosphere, as the plane slowly descended toward the city lights and the promise of justice, it was clear that this was only the beginning of a turbulent reckoning that would shake the very foundations of power and prejudice, leaving everyone, especially those who had once dared to remain silent, with no choice but to face the consequences of their inhumanity. Evelyn Johnson had spent a lifetime weathering life's storms with quiet dignity, but nothing could have. Back in the galley, Cassandra Reed, once a commanding senior flight attendant known for her sharp professionalism and polished smile, now sat trembling with despair. The familiar scent of citrus cleaner and cheap lotion clung to her hands, a reminder of the time when those aromas meant she was prepared to greet every passenger with an assuring smile and a confident stride. Now, that same smell only reminded her of how quickly everything could fall apart. No one had spoken to her since the captain's stern phone call, and even Brooke, a fellow crew member, had vanished into the silence that enveloped the cabin. Her colleagues, though not unkind, kept their distance out of a shared understanding. Cassandra had done something unforgivable. The whispers among the crew were already circling, a constant reminder that her name was now etched in the incident report, destined to be repeated in hushed tones at training sessions, in staff lounges, and over coffee breaks. They murmured things like, "Did you hear what Cassandra did? She lost it on a passenger," and "The woman's son is some billionaire. Now the whole airline's on fire because of it." Cassandra's carefully maintained reputation was disintegrating with every whispered word. Meanwhile, in seat 2B, Brandon Walker's finger hovered over his phone as unread messages from legal teams, executive staff, and board members lit up the screen. With a chill of determination, he read a text from his executive assistant, advising him that media outlets were beginning to notice their flight activity and suggesting that he prepare a statement. In his measured, deliberate tone, Brandon replied, "No press yet. Let them speak first, then we answer." It wasn't about revenge for him, though revenge simmered beneath his calm exterior. It was about a deep-seated responsibility to rectify an injustice he had witnessed too often. His mother, Evelyn, had simply asked for water, a basic human need, and in response she was insulted, dismissed, and humiliated in front of an entire first-class cabin. Brandon's anger was not one of petty vengeance, but a righteous indignation for all those who had suffered in silence, for all the voices that had been squelched by indifference and prejudice. As the plane descended and the landing gear thudded softly against the fuselage, the cabin lights flickered and city lights began to glow in the distance. Brandon leaned towards Evelyn and whispered, "Once we land, don't talk to anyone, just follow the officer at the door. He's with us." Evelyn nodded quietly, although a part of her had hoped that a quiet resolution might save them both further trouble. She knew from the unyielding look in her son's eyes that this incident would not be allowed to pass without consequences. Brandon was a man who once made up his mind. He followed through without hesitation. The aircraft touched down with a gentle rumble, the tires gripping the runway as the engines slowly thinned out their power. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. A silence that was not simply the pause between announcements, but the weight of collective judgment, of a situation that went far beyond a mere spilled drink. The captain's calm voice filled the cabin once again, informing the passengers that ground personnel would board briefly to address a matter concerning the crew. Every word was measured, yet the underlying message was clear. This was not over, but rather it had just begun. Outside, the airport lights glowed like small beacons in the night, while inside, the usual post-landing rush of excited chatter and stretching passengers was replaced by a somber vigilance. Every passenger seemed to be watching, waiting, as if each knew that a storm was about to break. A storm that would shake the very foundations of the airline's complacency regarding discrimination and callous behavior. Shortly thereafter, the cabin door slid open with a soft hiss, and a uniformed security officer stepped into first class. He was followed by a woman in a navy blazer who held a tablet and a leather folder, their appearance pristine and businesslike. "Good afternoon," she said softly, addressing only the crew at the front. "We are here to speak with one of your flight attendants, Cassandra Reed." The words struck the room like a shockwave. Cassandra, who had huddled in the rear galley trying to escape the reality of her own fall from grace, froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly rose, adjusting her jacket, her legs suddenly feeling weak as she walked slowly down the aisle. The passengers, previously resigned to a state of numb observation, now leaned in with interest, eyes fixed on her every step. She did her best to avoid Brandon's unyielding gaze, though it was impossible to ignore the cold, unreadable stare that followed her like a shadow. Upon reaching the front, the woman with the folder motioned for Cassandra to step aside. "Please come with us," she said, and Cassandra nodded stiffly. She cast a final, desperate glance towards the captain, seeking reassurance that never came. As she stepped out of the aircraft, the cabin door hissed shut behind her, and gasps as well as whispers rippled through the first-class area. Some passengers looked shocked, while others merely shook their heads in disbelief. Brandon remained silently immovable, his expression as hard as stone. Beside him, Evelyn shifted uncomfortably, a silent tremor of fear crossing her face, though she remained as calm as she could. She had seen too many painful truths in her life to let pity or fear overtake her dignity now. On the jet bridge, Cassandra's walk was stiff and mechanical as she was led between two stern officials. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, and every step felt like a descent into an abyss from which there was no escape. Employees from nearby offices peeked out from behind open doors, and even the ground staff tried to appear busy while sneaking anxious glances at her. The shame was tangible, her face flushing with the heavy burden of her actions. Finally, they led her through an unmarked door into a back hallway that was as sterile as it was unforgiving. A corridor that reeked of coffee and cleaning fluid, its white walls offering no comfort. The woman with the folder then spoke in a tone that brooked no argument. "You will be required to give a full written statement. Your employee ID has been temporarily locked. Until further notice, you are not to board another aircraft under this airline's name." Cassandra, defeated and alone, could only nod slowly, her hands gripping the strap of her small crew bag until her knuckles turned white. As Cassandra disappeared from view, the cabin door opened once again for Evelyn and Brandon. Brooke reappeared. In that quiet moment, as the final sounds of the landing procedures began to fade, the gravity of what had occurred sank deep into the hearts of everyone present. Evelyn, a proud, dignified woman who had faced countless adversities with grace, had once again been humbled by a society that judged her by her appearance and age. Yet, through it all, she remained resolute. Her silence was not one of submission, but rather a powerful declaration of endurance, a reminder that no amount of disdain or cruelty could ever truly break a spirit forged in the fires of lifetime hardship. Brandon's steady, silent determination and his willingness to put everything on the line spoke volumes about his commitment to justice, not only for his mother but for all the voiceless individuals who had suffered similar indignities. As they moved toward the waiting vehicle, the weight of the ordeal lingered in the air, a heavy reminder that each act of prejudice demanded an uncompromising response. In Brandon's mind, this wasn't just about personal revenge. It was about setting a precedent that no one, regardless of their standing or wealth, could treat a human being with such callous disregard. And though the flight had ended and Cassandra's fate was sealed in a series of unyielding corporate decisions, the ripples of that single moment of disrespect were just beginning to spread far beyond the confines of that first-class cabin. It was a reckoning, a thunderclap of accountability that promised to shake the very foundations of an industry built on indifference. For Evelyn Johnson, who had borne the brunt of an act that was as much about racial discrimination as it was about personal vendetta, the journey had taken an unforeseen turn. In that silent, charged moment on the jet bridge, the resolve of a son and the dignified silence of a woman intertwined to forge a new chapter. A chapter where injustice would no longer pass unchallenged, and where the power of quiet dignity would ultimately pave the way for a retribution so immense that it left onlookers in awe. Evelyn Johnson stepped off that plane with the quiet dignity of a woman who had endured decades of hardship and prejudice, a dignity that refused to be shaken even in the wake of unspeakable humiliation. As she and her son Brandon made their way along the jet bridge, every step echoed the silent defiance of a lifetime spent facing low blows with grace. A cool gust of air swept through the narrow corridor, blending the muted beeps of rolling suitcases and the distant chatter of arriving passengers with a palpable tension that followed them. It was as if the entire airport had paused to bear witness to the reckoning that had begun on board that ill-fated flight. A tall man in a tailored black suit waited near the end of the jet bridge, his lapel pin proudly displaying the airline executive board's emblem. Beside him stood a younger man clutching a digital tablet and wearing a headset, both straightening immediately as Brandon came into view. "Mr. Walker?" the older man said with a practiced but hollow smile that never reached his eyes. "Welcome home. We deeply regret the incident that occurred on this flight. Please accept our full apology on behalf of the airline." Brandon stopped in his tracks for a moment, his expression unreadable, and said nothing. The man continued rapidly, "We have already begun a formal review. Cassandra Reed has been suspended pending investigation. We take this matter very seriously." His tone, polished with corporate platitudes, did nothing to mask the underlying condescension that treated the severe mistreatment of his mother as a mere procedural hiccup. Brandon's voice came out low and firm as he interrupted. "If there's anything you or my mother need, we will speak in a private room." Without another word, the executives led them through a set of frosted glass doors into a quiet corridor lined with polished floors and softly lit walls. The room they entered, labeled Executive Lounge Private, was furnished with soft leather chairs around a mahogany table and boasted an array of untouched refreshments, a stark reminder that the airline's outward trappings of excellence were now nothing more than empty gestures. Evelyn settled gently near the window, her eyes fixed on the cityscape beyond, while Brandon remained standing with an intensity that seemed to fill the room. The board executive sat opposite Brandon and began reviewing a folder. "We have collected statements from the flight crew. The captain filed his initial report in flight, and we have access to the cabin camera footage," he said. Brandon folded his arms, his gaze unwavering. "And it matches what was described. Ms. Reed's behavior is simply unacceptable," the executive continued haltingly, listing off the charges. Cassandra Reed had made assumptions, disrespected a passenger, ignored the boarding list, and even went so far as to assault a customer. The words hung in the air like a heavy curtain, a stark indictment of a woman who had once prided herself on professionalism. Evelyn sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes calm yet piercing, as if to silently say that she would bear no further insults. Brandon's voice grew even sharper as he stepped forward. "Let me tell you something about process," he said calmly. "Process didn't stop her from mocking my mother. Process didn't stop her from raising her voice and insulting her in front of a cabin full of people. Nor did it prevent her from slapping a drink out of her hand as if my mother were a child. And protocol certainly didn't stop every single passenger and crew member from standing there in silent approval." His tone carried the weight of decades of suppressed frustration, of witnessing too many instances where those in power protected their own while leaving others to suffer. "The only reason any action is being taken now is because of my name, because my mother is someone who demands respect. If this had happened to anyone else, someone without our influence, there wouldn't have been even this meeting." The executive's face tightened at Brandon's words, but he did not argue. Evelyn looked up then and spoke softly, acknowledging the bitter truth. "He's not wrong." The room's atmosphere grew even denser with the gravity of the situation. The executive cleared his throat and said, "We understand the weight of this incident, ma'am, and we are committed to making things right." Brandon leaned forward, his eyes burning with a determined fire that seemed to cut through the polished veneer of corporate niceties. "Then listen carefully," he declared. "This isn't about punishing one employee. It's about exposing a culture that permits someone like Cassandra Reed to smile at every man in a suit, to offer service to those who shine in diamond bracelets, and then to turn her nose up at someone who, simply by the way she looks, is deemed unworthy. I demand immediate written confirmation that bias training will be implemented across the board. I want independent consultants to review and overhaul the passenger complaint tracking system, and I require a formal report distributed to every shareholder detailing this incident and the concrete steps you are taking to address it." A heavy silence followed. The executive hesitated as he realized the public path Brandon was prepared to force. "That is a very public course," he murmured. "Mr. Walker, we understand your position and we know your mother absolutely deserves respect." Brandon's response was swift and final. "If you protect Cassandra or your brand more than my mother's dignity, then I will handle it myself." He pulled out his phone and displayed a drafted statement that his media firm was already ready to send. A statement that would unleash a wave of accountability and force the airline into the public spotlight. "You'll have everything I asked for in writing within 48 hours, he said coolly, leaving the executive with no room for negotiation. With that, Brandon stood and moved toward the door, but before he left, he saw that his mother had not yet stood. He turned back, concern etched on his face. "Mom?" he asked softly. Evelyn looked up with a gentle smile, the kind that had weathered storms long before this day. "I'm coming, baby. I just needed a moment to breathe." As the executives made their final remarks and stepped aside, one of them placed his hand lightly on the table, signaling a reluctant truce. "Ma'am, if there is anything further we can do for you," began the executive, but Evelyn's voice was steady and clear. "Just make sure the next woman who looks like me does not have to live through what I did today." With that, she rose, adjusted the strap of her purse, and walked out, together with Brandon, leaving behind an air of quiet defiance and resolute power. Back in the main terminal, the automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the noise of the airport reclaimed the space. Footsteps, rolling suitcases, and chattering voices filled the air. Yet around the gate where they had just arrived, there lingered a hush, as if the crowd recognized that something monumental had just taken place. Security staff discreetly escorted them through a private corridor, flashing special clearance badges that allowed them to bypass the masses. Along the pristine white hallway with its dim lighting and faint scent of floor polish, Brandon led the way while constantly checking his phone, aware that more messages were arriving. His legal counsel had already sent over a draft of the airline's signed acknowledgement letter, and the board had reluctantly agreed to initiate an internal investigation. BS training was now set to become mandatory, and Brandon's next move would decide whether the public would be informed or if the matter would remain internal. Margaret paused near a large window overlooking the runway, where planes taxi and rise into the pale afternoon sky. She stood quietly, fingers gently touching the cold glass, lost in thought as the soft hum of the airport settled around her. Brandon stepped beside her, his gentle voice cutting into the reflective silence. "You okay?" he asked. Margaret nodded slowly and replied, "I'm just thinking about how far we've come and how far we still have to go," she continued softly. "Years ago, when I was in a waiting room at the hospital, I had to sit for nearly 40 minutes while a nurse passed by without even making eye contact. When your father asked what I did, I said nothing. It wasn't worth the trouble. But today was worth it." Brandon's throat tightened with emotion as he replied, "I couldn't stay quiet, Mom. Not after everything you've carried all these years. Not when the world still believes that people like you don't belong in certain seats." A soft knock interrupted their quiet moment. A man in a dark uniform appeared, badge reading Operations Supervisor. "Mr. Walker," he said politely, "your car is ready. It's waiting outside through the private exit." Brandon nodded once, and the man glanced at Margaret with a respectful smile. "It's an honor to meet you, ma'am," he said. Margaret returned a faint, gracious smile, a smile that reflected the inner strength of a woman who had finally spoken up for herself and, in doing so, had sparked a change that would not soon be forgotten. In that moment, as they walked together toward the waiting vehicle, the world outside seemed to carry on, oblivious to the storm of change that had just been unleashed. But for those who had witnessed it all, from the disdainful cruelty of Cassandra Reed to the resolute rebellion of Brandon and Evelyn Johnson, the memory of this day would forever serve as a powerful reminder that true dignity, when met with unwavering resolve, can transform even the darkest incidents into catalysts for lasting change. Evelyn Johnson stepped off the plane with an air of quiet dignity that belied the storm she had endured. Every step along the jet bridge, every glance exchanged with strangers, carried the heavy weight of a lifetime spent weathering injustice. The cool gust of air that swept through the corridor mingled with the low hum of rolling suitcases and muffled announcements. It felt as if the entire outside world had paused to bear witness to a reckoning that had begun at 35,000 feet, a reckoning that would forever mark the memory of everyone on that flight. At the end of the jet bridge, Brandon Walker's gaze was fixed on his mother as they neared a tall man in a tailored black suit. The man's lapel pin proudly displayed the emblem of the airline's executive board, and beside him stood a younger executive clutching a digital tablet and wearing a headset. When Brandon came into view, both men straightened in an almost mechanical display of corporate courtesy. "Mr. Walker, welcome home," the older man said with a practiced smile that failed to reach his eyes. "We deeply regret the incident on this flight. Please accept our full apology on behalf of the airline." Brandon said nothing as he listened, his expression unreadable, a storm of controlled determination swirling behind his calm demeanor. The executive's words tumbled out rapidly. They had already begun a formal review, and Cassandra Reed, the flight attendant whose callous action had shattered centuries of quiet resilience in his mother, was suspended pending investigation. "We are taking this matter very seriously," he added in a tone that sounded more like a recitation of corporate protocol than a sincere apology. Brandon's voice, low and unyielding, broke the corporate script. "If there is anything you or my mother need, we will speak in a private room." Without waiting for a further response, they were led through a set of frosted glass doors into a quiet corridor lined with polished floors and softly lit walls. Inside a room labeled Executive Lounge Private, the sterile opulence of leather chairs and a mahogany conference table seemed almost an affront to the raw emotion pulsing in the room. Evelyn settled near a window, her eyes fixed on the distant cityscape, while Brandon remained standing, arms folded, his every movement radiating purpose. The board executive opened a folder and began, "We have collected statements from the flight crew, the captain filed an initial report, and we have access to the cabin camera footage." Brandon's eyes narrowed as he listened. The executive continued haltingly, recounting that Cassandra Reed had not only disrespected a passenger, but had also treated her as if she were less than human, making assumptions, dismissing her basic need for water, and even physically assaulting her by slapping a drink out of her hand. "Process didn't stop her from mocking my mother," Brandon said sharply, stepping closer. His voice was calm but layered with the anguish and fury of decades of witnessing his mother's silent suffering. "Process didn't stop her from raising her voice, insulting her in full view of everyone on that flight, or from treating her like she wasn't even worthy of a seat in first class. And let's be clear, the only reason any action is being taken now is because of my name. If this had happened to someone without our influence, you and I both know nothing would ever have come of it." The executive's face tightened at Brandon's words, but he said nothing further. Evelyn, with a soft yet steely resolve, added, "He's not wrong." The air in that room was heavy with unspoken truths. The executive offered another apology, promising to make things right. But Brandon's next words cut deeper than any corporate promise. "Then listen carefully. This isn't just about punishing one careless employee. This is about exposing a culture that lets someone like Cassandra Reed smile politely at every man in a suit and serve drinks to those who fit the expected image, while turning her nose up at someone who simply doesn't conform to a narrow, discriminatory ideal." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, ensuring every person present felt the impact of his words. "I demand written confirmation that bias training is to be implemented immediately. I want independent consultants to review our passenger complaint system, and I require a formal report distributed to every shareholder detailing how you are going to ensure no one ever humiliates a woman like my mother again." A heavy silence fell. The executive hesitated, clearly aware that Brandon's threat was not an idle one. "That is a very public course," he murmured, prompting Brandon to lean forward even further. "If you try to protect her, if you try to shield your brand over my mother's dignity, then I will make sure the truth comes out, regardless of your internal processes." In that moment, Brandon pulled out his phone and displayed a drafted statement from his media team, a statement that would ignite a firestorm of accountability across every major news outlet. "You will have what I have demanded in writing within 48 hours, he said, his tone brooking no argument. After that intense exchange, Brandon moved to the door, but not before noticing his mother had not yet risen. He turned back, concern etched in his eyes. "Mom?" he asked softly. Evelyn looked up and offered a gentle smile, the smile of a woman who had weathered more than most could imagine. "I'm coming, baby. I just needed a moment to breathe." Outside, as they stepped into the cool night air, a black SUV waited with its engine idling and tinted windows guarding the privacy of those inside. The driver graciously opened the door for Evelyn, who stepped in slowly, her eyes scanning the nearby crowd. A few travelers watched with curiosity, some even raising their phones covertly to snap discreet photos. Brandon assisted his mother, closing the door with a tenderness that belied the fierce battle waged just moments before. As he circled the vehicle and paused, his eyes caught a glimpse of Cassandra Reed being led through a staff hallway by 2 HR officers. Her uniform jacket was half unbuttoned, her hair disheveled, and her face a mask of pale resignation. She passed by without acknowledging Brandon, and he did not call out, a silent testament to the finality of her fall from grace. Once inside the SUV, Brandon provided the driver with the address of their private residence, and then the vehicle slid away from the curb. Neither he nor Evelyn spoke during the ride. Silence prevailed, a silence not born of awkwardness, but of contemplative resolve. The city skyline receded in the rearview mirror as they drove along the highway. Inside the car, thoughts and memories filled the quiet space, swirling with emotions unspoken and experiences long buried by years of forced silence. Evelyn leaned back, her gaze fixed on the landscape passing by through the tinted glass. She no longer looked tired, she looked resolute, as if she had achieved a quiet truth that illuminated the path ahead. Brandon, his phone lying face down on the console, allowed himself a rare moment of introspection. Today had stripped away layers of pride and anger, exposing something raw and fundamental. a deep-seated injustice that had been inflicted on his mother and countless others far too many times. Looking over at Evelyn, he saw a faint smile play on her lips, a smile that surprised him. "You're smiling?" he asked gently. Evelyn didn't immediately reply, but finally said, "I'm thinking about how that flight attendant looked when they escorted her out. I'm not saying I feel sorry for her, because I don't excuse what she did. But I know shame when I see it." Brandon's eyes darkened with lingering anger as he absorbed her words. "You mean she humiliated you like you were invisible?" he murmured. Evelyn nodded slowly. "She decided you didn't belong, and now she knows better, if only through the harsh lesson of public disgrace." Brandon's jaw clenched, but he said nothing more until Evelyn, with quiet pride, continued softly, "You did what I never would have. You held her accountable. You stood up for me, for every quiet person who's ever been dismissed without a word." His eyes softened for a moment before hardening again. "You shouldn't have had to fight for your dignity," she added. "I should have spoken louder, but I learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone else raise their voice for you." They rode in contemplative silence for a few more moments. Finally, the SUV pulled up to a modern, glass-walled home with an orderly driveway and neatly trimmed hedges. As the vehicle slowed and stopped, Evelyn and Brandon stepped out, greeted by the warm smile of a housekeeper at the door. "Welcome home, Mr. Walker. Mrs. Walker, it's good to see you," she said softly. Evelyn returned the smile with a grace born of hardship and resolve, saying, "Thank you, Nora. It's good to be here." Inside, the home exuded calm and order, the subtle scent of fresh citrus cleaner mixed with faint vanilla, the polished marble floors reflecting soft light. Everything was intentionally calm, designed to be a haven after the emotional turmoil they had just experienced. In the sitting room, Evelyn sank into a cream-colored sofa with a soft sigh, as if finally releasing years of pent-up sorrow. Brandon disappeared briefly to the kitchen and returned with a cup of hot tea, which he placed gently before her. He sat across from her, his eyes distant as memories and emotions played silently in the space between them. "I still can't believe it happened," Brandon said almost to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn took a slow sip of her tea and replied, "I can, and I understand. It's not new, it's not rare. You just saw it today." Brandon ran a hand through his hair. "I always knew people like Cassandra existed, but I never expected someone to be so brazen and casual about it." Evelyn's eyes softened with both pity and a hardened strength. "That's because you built a world where you never had to endure that kind of treatment," she said quietly. "But the rest of us, those of us without that name, know what it's like to feel invisible." Brandon's voice trembled with restrained anger as he replied, "You raised me to believe that I belonged in any room, and today she tried to make you feel like you didn't deserve a seat you paid for. That's what makes me furious." Evelyn's tone grew reflective as she admitted, "I used to believe that remaining silent would keep the peace, that keeping my head down was strength. But today I learned that sometimes true strength is in letting someone else speak for you, so that the world finally listens." Brandon's eyes were heavy with regret. "I wish I had seen it sooner, that I had fought harder for you, for all the times I ignored it." As they reached the gates, Brandon looked out at the crowd of onlookers. Travelers who had watched, who had taken clandestine photos, who had quietly witnessed an act of injustice that would resonate with them forever. "What happened today will live on in their memories," Evelyn said softly as she gazed out at the departing crowd. "Not just the shameful act itself, but the way you stood up and made them feel something real." Brandon leaned his head against the window, and with a quiet finality he said, "I hope they remember, because memory is more powerful than any lawsuit or corporate apology." Their words hung in the cool evening air as they stepped into the welcoming darkness of home. A home that, tonight, felt like a sanctuary after a long, hard-fought battle against a culture of silence and neglect. Evelyn Johnson's story had come full circle that evening as she sat with Brandon in the warm light of their home, the echoes of the day still lingering like the soft aftertaste of a well-lived memory. Brandon raised an eyebrow as he asked gently, Do you want me to give her a second chance?" His voice carried the weight of a man used to commanding empires, but not forgiving wrongs so easily. Evelyn considered his question carefully. "I don't want her punished for the sake of punishment," she said in a measured tone that betrayed years of quiet suffering and hard-won wisdom. "But I do want her changed. Sometimes, people only change when the whole world stops forgiving their comfort." Brandon exhaled slowly, nodding in a way that showed he understood the truth in his mother's words. As the last vestiges of daylight filtered through the trees outside, the sky darkened, and the day's end promised that its echoes would last far beyond the fading sunlight. The conversation shifted into something that felt bigger than just one incident on a plane. "You built empires, Brandon," Evelyn said softly, "but today you built something better. You set a standard." Brandon, with a hint of surprise in his voice, asked, "What do you mean?" Evelyn smiled gently, her eyes reflecting both the pain of injustice and the hope of change. "You told the world what you will and will not allow when it comes to treating people. You showed that it's not merely about power, it's about principle." Her words struck deeply, resonating with the countless moments when she had been made to feel less than worthy simply because she looked different, because others assumed she didn't belong. In the quiet that followed, an official chime signaled a new message. Brandon picked up his phone, and when he read the words silently, his jaw tightened. It was from the airline's CEO. Every measure he had demanded was being implemented, and retraining of staff would begin immediately. "No photo op, though," Brandon murmured, and Evelyn nodded in agreement. They needed the change to be genuine, not a shallow gesture meant to polish a tarnished image. Later, as the morning sun filled their living room with soft light, Brandon and Evelyn sat together at a table, sipping tea. The gentle aroma of freshly brewed tea mingled with the scent of memories from a long, arduous journey. Brandon unfolded the written apology that Cassandra Reed had submitted, a document that, though admitting fault, also revealed a woman grappling with her own shortcomings. "She said she judged you," Brandon said, his tone low. "She admitted it was the first time someone made her see herself as others might have seen her." Evelyn took a slow sip, then replied softly, "I know it wasn't right. I would never have done what she did to you, but perhaps, through this, she can learn what it means to see you as worthy." Brandon leaned back, absorbing his mother's quiet resolve. "Sometimes the strongest punishment is the burden of one's own choices," he said. "If she truly changes, then maybe that painful moment on the plane will mean something." Evelyn smiled, a smile of both forgiveness and warning. "Remember, my dear," she said, "the next time someone treats another with disdain, let them remember that dignity demands accountability." In that moment, as the quiet strength of a new day filled the room, both mother and son understood that true power was not measured in money or revenge, but in the courage to stand up for what is right and make sure the world never forgets that every person deserves to be seen and heard. Evelyn Johnson and her son Brandon Walker sat together in the quiet aftermath of a day that had changed everything. As the warm glow of dusk crept over the yard, Brandon looked at his mother and asked softly, "Will they remember what happened?" Evelyn's eyes twinkled with a mix of sorrow and fierce determination. "I think some will," she replied in that gentle yet unyielding tone that had seen her through decades of unspoken trials. "And what about those who may forget the names or the details?" Brandon asked, his voice low yet resolute. "They'll remember the feeling," Evelyn answered, nodding slowly, "the change that stirred inside them. Sometimes, that inner shift is all it takes to create lasting change." The truth of her words hung in the air like the lingering scent of fresh citrus cleaner mixed with a hint of jasmine from the garden outside. A reminder of... Brandon leaned back, his eyes softening for a moment as he absorbed his mother's wisdom. "They'll remember, even if it's just a subtle shift in their hearts," he said, a gentle smile playing at the corner of his lips. Perhaps not the names or the events down to the last detail, but that undeniable feeling, a feeling that tells them our society must do better. Evelyn, with her silver hair gently stirred by the evening breeze, closed her eyes briefly, as if to let the weight of the day settle into something beautiful and transformative. "You have always been strong, Brandon," she murmured. "I have watched you build empires, shape industries, and today you built something even more important: the courage to stand up for what is right, regardless of how deeply ingrained the wrongs may be." Their conversation drifted like a warm current through the quiet room, where no grand speeches or orchestral crescendos were needed to mark the moment. It was just two people, a determined mother and her devoted son, reflecting on the aftermath of an incident that had shattered silence. The day had ended, yet its echo would live on in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. They spoke of change, of the kind that rises up from the ashes of humiliation and transforms pain into a message that cannot be ignored. "I know that some may not remember every detail of the injustice we faced," Brandon said, his voice heavy with both regret and hope. "But I believe they will never forget the feeling it stirred inside them. That is, in itself, a victory. It is a start, a powerful reminder that every person deserves to be seen, to be heard, and treated with respect." Evelyn's soft smile deepened as she watched her son, whose inner fire had long been the source of her own resilience. "We must teach the world that silence in the face of prejudice is not acceptable," she said quietly. "I have spent far too many years keeping my head down, accepting small indignities, thinking that silence meant strength. Today I learned that the greatest strength comes from demanding dignity and accountability." Brandon nodded slowly, fully aware that his mother's life had been a testament to enduring grace in a world that often overlooked her worth. "You did what was necessary, Mom," he said. "By standing up for yourself, you gave voice to everyone who has ever been treated as invisible. In that moment, you reminded us all that we cannot allow cruelty to go unchecked, no matter how subtle it may seem." Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, an unspoken promise was made. A promise that the memory of that day would shape a new standard of respect, not only within the walls of the airline and its boardrooms, but throughout the lives of all who had witnessed it. As the sun slipped behind the horizon and darkness began to settle gently over their home, Brandon and Evelyn sat together in a silence that was anything but empty. It was filled with the reassuring knowledge that justice, though it might not come in the form of swift, dramatic revenge, was already taking root in change, a change that would ripple outward, altering perspectives and reminding the world that every person, regardless of age or appearance, holds an intrinsic value that cannot be diminished by prejudice. And so, in that serene, reflective moment, as the cool night embraced them, they both understood that sometimes the simplest truth, the acknowledgement of every human's right to dignity, was the most powerful force of all. This was the moment when silence transformed into a movement, when indifference gave way to empathy, and when the strength of one woman's quiet persistence illuminated a path for others to follow.